Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week is Frances O'Grady, who has just stepped down at the end of 2022 as General Secretary of the TUC. She spent her whole working life in the trade union movement, and she now sits as a Labour peer in the House of Lords, where she is committed to its abolishment. So Frances,
making
thank you for
myself
coming
redundant. Let's see.
Yeah. But you have left your job in the trade union movement at one of the most critical times in your lifetime for the trade union movement, with the nearest thing to a general strike we're going to see, so many people in dispute, and workers' rights eroded to a large degree. So it must feel very odd for you sort of walking away from that frontline job.
Well, I know it's in safe hands with Paul Novak, my successor, who's also a good mate. But I think what we're seeing is a wave of industrial action running on a very long fuse. If you think that we've had 12 years of pay stagnation, real wage cuts, particularly in the public sector, people feeling, workers leaving their jobs in droves, high levels of vacancies, workloads through the roof, people feeling really stressed. Why should I carry on, even though it's my vocation, when I could get a job that's better paid, less stressful down the road? So, we are seeing a wave of action. And I guess what's clear is that the government currently isn't tackling the cause of that action and instead is just trying to suppress the symptoms.
But does part of you, now that you don't have to speak for the movement, think, well, there are lots of ways in which trade unions have failed their membership, and that's partly why we're here as well, in that, well, not just trade unions have failed their membership, but the trade union system, if you like, has failed to defend workers' rights.
I think if you look over the history of the trade union movement, without doubt, there are peaks and troughs in terms of progress towards some dignity for labour and decent rights and decent pay, living standards. And what we've seen is that kind of very deliberate decline in trade union membership that under Thatcher, where we had the first introduction of massive anti-trade union laws, the decimation of our manufacturing industry, fragmentation of business models, so lots more small workplaces, much harder to organise. And it was why when I first came in, organising was always the number one, because in the end, this isn't, I was a trade union rep as a young woman. I know it's not the fault of unions. It's about strength in numbers. Unless we can organise, particularly in the private sector, then of course the worst employers will get away with as much as they can. And we saw that with the pretty disgraceful behaviour of P&O, where I didn't see the government rushing to legislate. Instead, there was a lot of talk about dealing with that kind of exploitation.
But they didn't do very much.
They got away with it. They got away with breaking the law, sacking hundreds of workers over Zoom, and replacing them with cheap agency labour. Again, it was disgusting and people knew it was wrong, and yet the government failed to act. And yet, what's the first thing top of their agenda when they're faced with a strike wave after over a decade of falling living standards, is to suppress the symptoms by making it harder to strike, harder to bargain for fair pay, and for goodness sake, suing unions and sacking nurses who go on strike.
But when you look at the sort of the bald economic figures that show living standards in decline for years and years, and many sectors, living on real wages that are lower than they were 10 years ago, that's got to be a sort of a failure of collective bargaining, hasn't it?
Well, it's
how did that happen? If it wasn't for the weakness of the trade unions?
Without doubt, I think we all have to take our share of responsibility. But it's up to us in the end. It's up to us as working people. Either we get organised and push back, or the worst employers will do their worst. So it's up to us. And I think we also need to acknowledge we've got a particular model of capitalism, not just in this country, but around the world, that is driving up profits, driving down pay, shrinking the share of the total wealth that workers produce. You're seeing that right around the world. And I think there's been a big shift that maybe in the trade union movement, there needs to be more thought given to this.
Yeah.
That when, in the past, the biggest, richest multinationals in the world were banking, finance, energy companies. Nowadays, it's big tech, and they have unprecedented industrial power, but also political power and power over our ordinary lives. And I think that, together with progressive governments, is something that the global trade union movement needs to get to grips with.
I mean, you mentioned Margaret Thatcher very early on, as I would expect you to, but don't you then also have to kind of hand it to her in her sort of political strategy, in that what she did was begin this sort of share-owning culture in which profit and business success was seen as the great measure of economic success, rather than the kind of conditions we live in, equality,
society,
all those things.
Such a thing.
There was a political genius in that, wasn't there?
Well, she certainly had a vision. You've got to acknowledge
which people
that.
bought into.
And the vision was all about trickle-down economics, that if the rich get richer, eventually some of those crumbs off the table will find their way into the grateful hands of workers, but at a price of deliberately setting out to break working-class organisations, starting with the pits and the NUM, and also at a price of, in my book, basic decency, that she obviously came from a particular background herself. I do notice this in life, that there are people who know why solidarity matters. It's an old-fashioned word, but it means looking after each other, people looking after each other, everybody paying a fair share into the pot and looking after those who are most vulnerable, but everybody having a stake in our public services, our NHS, our education system, welfare. And she set out to break that. Well, for those of us who weren't born with silver spoons in our mouths or had to rely on the kindness of strangers, that is a pretty terrifying vision. And I think it's probably taken this long for people to realise how much damage it's caused, because in the end, you can't have a strong economy, you can't have a just economy unless you also have a just society. And I think that's what she broke.
Haven't you also spent your whole working life in the unions facing a situation where the union's image was weak? You've been trying to rectify the 70s image of union barons, of union bosses, of beer and sandwiches with weak Labour governments. And this perception that the unions were too strong and were trying to push politicians around or bring down the Thatcher government in the 80s. You've been, that's been something you've had to contend with, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the first part of my working life, I was in the trade union movement as an activist. I went to work for the Transport and General Workers Union when I was in my early 30s. So I knew what trade unionism meant on the ground, and it was about sticking up for each other, looking after each other, making sure that people were treated fairly at work and got a fair share of the pie. But I always said, when I came into the trade union movement, and particularly when I started at the TUC, you could see that there was this pale, ale and stale image. I got into trouble for saying that maybe publicly, a bit too publicly, but it was true in my book. And it wasn't necessarily people's experience on the ground either. So we were selling ourselves short. But, without doubt at that time, all of the big unions were led by white men. There was a culture that was built around what suited men. And of course, what we've seen since that time is massive changes with now, our biggest unions led by women.
But to what extent do you think you're having to make up for those failures of the 70s?
Well, there's a whole generation of workers who were at school in the 70s or weren't born in the 70s. So I think it's...
But it's still the measure, isn't it? And it's still the measure that's quoted now.
It's a measure in the pages of certain newspapers, which may have a particular interest in not painting trade unionism in its best colours, and there's a particular interest in parts of government. But I think it's backfired. I know that this so-called culture war, when you pick an issue and hope that it sets the public against the particular group that you're highlighting. That started with Boris Johnson. We became aware at the TUC that in number 10, trade unions had been identified as the number one so-called culture war that was going to be picked alongside asylum seekers and other, anybody on welfare has always had a rough ride under the Tories. But, the idea was to pick a fight. And it was a sign of desperation, a sign of weakness on the part of the government that they wanted to pick that fight with us. But I think they miscalculated. And one of the reasons they miscalculated was they were trying to recycle stereotypes from the 1970s that just didn't fit with people's real experience of trade unionism anymore.
But that sort of, the way they pit people is still what they're doing. I mean,
they're still trying to.
Still talks in terms of union bosses against working people.
Yeah. Well,
obviously, that union general secretaries represent working people.
And are elected by working people. It's disrespectful to working people to describe union leaders as bosses because they're elected.
What we're also seeing, for the first time in a long time, is all of these disputes at the same time.
Yeah.
And so, the health service and different elements of health workers going on strike at the same time as civil servants, at the same time as the railway workers. Now, the polls suggest that if you ask people who they have sympathy with, there is a difference. That they have more sympathy, obviously, with nurses than they do with train drivers. But do you think this is all sort of working in concert to some degree and that each dispute is helping the other?
Well, there's a simple reason why there's a wave of disputes. It's because they're all experiencing the same cause, which is real wage cuts. And it's not just this year, it's not just through the pandemic. This stretches back over 10 years. So it's not surprising that unless they get a fair deal, workers feel they have no other choice but to vote for strike action. Now, the government has a big role to play, particularly with the private sector, where we're seeing by far the biggest real wage cuts. They could put more money on the table. They keep saying they can't afford it. We've come up with lots of ideas about how they could afford it. And again, I think they're misjudging the public mood because, you can't screw down nurses' pay and lift the cap on bankers' bonuses. You can't say we can't afford it when everybody knows that the wealthy and big corporations could afford to pay a bit more. And even if we just equalise capital gains tax and income tax, that could generate at least 15 billion quid, which would more than pay for a decent pay rise for everybody.
So, let's go back to the beginning of your career, if you like. Because you've always worked in the trade union movement. It's not, some union leaders sort of have got a job and then decided to get involved with the union. And then,
well, in my 20s and early 30s, I was doing various jobs in hospitality, in shop work, and in the voluntary sector. And then I did get a job working for the Transport and General Workers Union when Ron Todd was the leader, and I'd been a rep and an activist, and it was the best job I could ever have dreamed of. To be able to work for the trade union movement was, it was all my Christmases at once.
And why was that? Was it family and growing up in a in a family where you had that background?
I think it was partly family, without doubt. I've had a brother who was a NUM member who'd been on strike. My dad was a rep in the car industry. Some of my sisters had been reps in the public services. So my granddad, my lovely Dublin granddad, was an inspiration. But it was also my own experiences of what it's like to do a job and to want to do that job well. And I saw being a union rep as part and parcel of that same feeling that you were standing up for dignity at work and trying to get the best deal that you could, and understanding that critically depended on how well organised your workplace was.
Had you any idea that that's what you wanted to do? Because you
No,
were the first in your family to go to university,
Yeah.
weren't you?
Yeah. And of course, I didn't have a clue what I wanted to do. I was clueless until I kind of realised that you could do this full time. You know, the work that you were doing as a rep, fundamentally, it was the same.
But there was a career there.
A vocation, I would call it. Yeah, more that, you know, it's a cause rather than a career. It's and that is I'm very conscious that's a privilege to have that in your life, you know, that you can do something you really believe in.
But we've talked about the cliche of the union leader being, you know, this sort of very male, obviously working class cliche versus the reality today, which is really quite different.
Well, the working class has changed, or at least I think there was a time when you know, there were some politicians who were almost trying to fashion a sort of stereotype that the working class could only be male, white, and wear a flat cap. Well, that's never been the case, but it's especially not the case now.
But when you say politicians were trying to create that image, what do you mean? Who are you talking about?
Well,
and when?
This obsession with the white working class, which I remember being really puzzled about when I first heard it, and it was nearly always talking about men, not women. But, you know, I guess my whole kind of life experience has always been, well, the working class has always been multiracial.
Are you surprised by the extent to which the pandemic has dramatically changed working practices?
Yeah, I'll be honest. How long that lasts is another question. But there was almost like this sort of quiet rebellion, wasn't there, for many kind of workers, those workers who could work from home, holding on to that as a way of working. One of our kind of challenges as a trade union movement was most people couldn't do their jobs from home. So what does flexibility look like for them? What's you know, the equivalent progress? And, you know, again, talking to workers, predictability of hours actually was very often at least as important as anything else, because if you're just at the beck and call of a boss on the end of a mobile phone, that doesn't make for a great family life either. So, you know, being able to swap your shifts, being able to organise your own rosters, you know, there are ways that you can make every job more flexible on workers' terms.
What do you think about the sort of the way of thinking that some young people have, which is that they want ultimate flexibility? You know, they don't necessarily think, you know, start a job and think this is what I'm going to do for 10 years or the rest of my life. They think I'll do this for a bit and then I'll do something else for a bit, and I'll do something else for a bit. And therefore they quite often are on casual contracts. They won't be a member of a union. But that flexibility is sort of hailed as a good thing by many people.
Yeah, I think one of the things that genuinely upsets me is that very often people's idea of what it means to have fair conditions at work has, you know, our standards have become so low because very often young people don't know anything else. They think the only form of flexibility is 0 hours contracts, where no, you could have a permanent steady contract and still have flexibility if that agreement is negotiated between unions and employers, and we have lots of those agreements. But I also think there's something deeper going on. It's almost like a distrust and detachment from work. You know, in the old days, we'd talk about that psychological contract that workers would, you know, they'd go the extra mile for an employer if the pressure was on the basis that they knew the employer would then reward them fairly, maybe give them time off in lieu, whatever it might be. Now, a lot of that old contract, alongside all the consensus about welfare state, how you treat people, respecting unions. It feels like it's broken down and needs to be rebuilt, that there needs to be a sense of give and take for sure, but on a basis of some parity of esteem and fair treatment.
And how do you think business feels about that?
I think that there are business leaders I talk to who absolutely get that. And there are others who I think, because of the way the corporate governance rules in this country are written, it's shareholders first, second and last. So, over recent years, we've seen payouts to shareholders rise 3 times faster than pay. Again, it's that shrinking workers' share of the pie. It's all at the expense of ordinary people's living standards, profits growing, shareholder payouts growing, top pay has grown enormously over the pandemic. A real rupture now between what's happened to the people who actually do the work and the boardroom. So, I struggle to understand how some leaders can appear to get it, but in practice are still not treating their workforces fairly.
I suppose what I'm getting at is how careful and how worried does Labour need to be about fixing some of the things that you've been talking about? The sort of the cliche, I suppose, is that Labour will back off doing too much to frighten business when it thinks it's going to get into government because it doesn't want to blow it.
I think Labour's already set out a really good plan. They've called it a New Deal for Workers. It's about fair pay agreements at a sectoral level so that you bring employers to the table and create that level playing field so that the decent employer isn't undercut by the bad, getting rid of those 0 hours contracts, getting rid of fire and rehire, repealing anti-trade union legislation. And there are other countries who are doing this. New Zealand, we've talked to government ministers and trade unionists there who've introduced fair pay agreements. They had to battle it through Parliament, just in the same way that we, many years ago, had to battle for a national minimum wage. That will settle down and we'll see how that goes. But the potential to lift some of the lowest paid workers into decent pay. And of course, we went to Spain recently. Fascinating work there on trying to get to grips with the gig economy and actually setting an objective about the proportion of the workforce we want to see on steady contracts, decent pay, and setting that as an ambition, as a goal, a mission. So I think there's kind of cause for optimism because there are models out there, and a Labour government in power could work with those other progressive governments and trade union movements to make it happen.
And as a former trade union leader, how do you feel about the transition Labour's gone through from Jeremy Corbyn, who would have been with you on absolutely everything, to Keir Starmer, who will probably argue the toss on quite a lot of things, and is clearly more centrist, and is going to be as easily on your side?
In the trade union movement, they always used to call us principled pragmatists. So that means that we tend to focus on policies rather than personalities, just as Tony Benn used to encourage us to do. What we're interested in is results, making a real difference to working lives. As I said, I think Labour's New Deal for Workers will make a real difference to millions of workers' lives and start tilting that balance of power and wealth that in this country has gone far too far in favour of the super rich.
But does that mean you'd rather have a less radical Labour government in government rather than a more radical Labour opposition?
Well, hopefully that's not the choice we're given. But
well, it kind of is, isn't it, in truth? That's what's happened between Jeremy Corbyn and Keir Starmer.
Well, I think there's an appetite in the country. I think there's, one of the things that the TUC pressed for very hard was British energy, was that we needed to take back some levers of control over our economy. And that does mean that, you know, you need to pick strategic areas where you have public interest, whether it's golden shares, whether it's nationalisation, whether it's, there are lots of different ways of doing it. But you do need to have some levers. Otherwise, the market is not going to deliver for ordinary people in the country.
So that's the kind of radical policy that you think
is Labour has committed to
yes.
British Energy. So I think that's a real step forward. The commitment to bringing back services that were outsourced. Again, I know this doesn't make headlines, but I know it will make a massive difference to people's lives. Every cleaner I speak to doesn't want, forgive me, but they don't want to say they work for some anonymous multinational company. They want to work for the hospital, the local hospital, and that's what they're proud to do. So bring those services back, treat people decently, and it will pay us dividends in the long run, because we know that the country needs a healthy, educated workforce that can move around. Public services, publicly owned, are critical to the success of our economy.
So do you disagree with Mick Lynch when he says he doesn't, Labour's got to decide which, whose side it's on, and sort of implies that Labour's, not much use in this particular dispute?
Well, I've got huge respect for Mick Lynch, who works all the hours God sends to stand up for his members who elected him to try and get them a
But he's not glowing about Labour.
And he's, it's a broad church. It's a big family, the Labour movement. Not everybody's going to agree with everybody else at the same time. But I tell you, the trade union movement campaigned for that New Deal for working people, those practical commitments to get rid of some of the worst low pay and exploitation in this country. Labour's promised to do it. We'll hold them to that promise, because that's what the trade union movement is for. That's what the Labour movement is for. But, I have no doubt in my mind that it will be delivered.
Are there things that you wish you'd got to as General Secretary that you didn't?
Well, I think, one of the big things we did was get that furlough scheme introduced, which saved over 10 million livelihoods. That was big. And it means, I think, no future government can say, oh, we'll just have to put up with mass unemployment. We know we've got a ready-made scheme now, designed in the trade union movement on the back of what was the best happening internationally, picking the best.
Because Rishi Sunak says he designed that.
Yeah.
No, did he not?
Well, I'm not saying anything about him, but sometimes some men like to claim all the best ideas were theirs. But this was one that genuinely came from the trade union movement. We produced a report. I discussed it with the then Chancellor in great detail. We met. We had people in the Treasury working on it. We didn't get everything we wanted, but we got one of the best schemes in Europe.
So do you think that's your big career achievement?
I think that's one of the things I'm proudest of. At a personal level, one of the other things I'm proudest of is setting up the Organising Academy to train up new generation of organisers, because in the end, that's where I believe we get our power from. That if the more workers who join unions, the stronger we'll be, the bigger voice we'll have. I wish I'd done more for single mothers. As a single mother myself, I think maybe we could declare in praise of Single Mother's Day, where we recognise single parents, fathers too. But, it's a tough job bringing up kids, doing a job, holding down a job, making ends meet. And, certainly when I was a young single mother, there was a lot of prejudice, which has an impact on children as well, stigmatising children.
Were you affected by that yourself? I mean, is that why perhaps you didn't talk about it as much?
I think I didn't want to be seen to be self-indulgent in a way, that this was my experience and I'm going to use this platform, to amplify that.
Because I've read interviews with you where you've refused to talk about it and said, I'm not going to talk about the kids.
Yeah, I wouldn't talk about my kids as individuals, because I think they're they didn't choose for their mum to do the job she did. But I do remember, an interview with Peter Lilly coming on the radio when we were brushing our teeth in the morning, that kind of frantic bit where you're trying to get them off to school.
Peter Lilly being the former Conservative cabinet minister,
who did that really
who famously read a poem at Conservative Party
sang
conference.
a little song suggesting that all single mothers got themselves pregnant, like Madonna,
to get on the housing
to get a council flat. And I just remember, and my kids hearing this and wanting, frankly, to, pull the plug on the radio.
I think in the interest of, because a lot of our listeners won't remember the ditty, but let me see if I can find it. I think I've got it here somewhere. It's
Gilbert and Sullivan.
So this was Peter Lilly, who was at the time in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet.
Yes.
Who went to Conservative Party conference and said, I've got a little list of benefit offenders who I'll soon be rooting out and who never would be missed. They never would be missed. There's those who make up bogus claims in half a dozen names and councillors who draw the dole to run left-wing campaigns. They never would be missed. They never would be missed. There's young ladies who get pregnant just to jump the housing queue and dads who won't support the kids of ladies they have kissed. And so it went on. That was the famous moment.
Yes. And, I did think at the time, I'm not the only one with kids hearing this, and having to hear it. And just how, as I say, how sexist, how rude, how disgusting, and how out of touch, no human empathy, that actually most single parents don't choose to be single parents. And it's tough.
When you say you wish you'd done more, beyond recognising the difficulties, what do you think needs to be done for single parents that hasn't been done?
Affordable childcare would make such a difference. I mean, I try and remember all of this, even though I'm a lot older now. But I remember at that time, as I say, as important to me as anything in my wage packet was I couldn't earn a wage packet unless I had affordable childcare. And if arrangements broke down, it was a complete nightmare.
Listening to you, I mean, you sound quite tribal as a person. You don't like Conservatives, that's clear. But in the last few months, what we've seen is, proposals brought forward by Liz Truss and Andrea Leadsom, which were about childcare, now rejected by Rishi Sunak. So are you able to see allies across on the other side?
Of course. When we, another big milestone for me was that 2016 Anti-Trade Union Act. And we worked right across the political spectrum. And there were people who got it just as they're getting it in terms of the nonsense that we're hearing about, striking workers and suing their unions with new legislation on minimum service levels today. So that, of course, and that actually is one of the pleasures of trade unionism for me, is that you have people from all walks of life, all sorts of different views, but that you come together around the same core values, including dignity of labour. And, so I've always tried to take people as I find them. So I won't deny, of course, there's tribalism there, and that is, who I am. That's a product of my upbringing, my experiences, my family. But I have also tried to be open to the idea, that there can be decent people in all walks of life, and I'll judge people on what they do.
I mean, you talked a lot about the good policy that you think Labour has adopted. Let's just assume that the polls are right and we're looking at a Labour government in 18 months or 2 years' time. Do you think it's possible for them to actually sort things out? Or are things now so bad that they will inevitably disappoint?
I think it absolutely is possible to sort things out. There are things that can be done in the first 100 days, like improving labour standards at work. You can do that in the first 100 days, and actually that will be good for the private sector. As I say, it will stop decent businesses being undercut by bad, and I have spoken to plenty of businesses who would like to see rights at work strengthened. There are things that will take longer. What I think is really important is that the an incoming Labour government is very clear about its direction. And I think, again, there is an appetite in the country for investment in our infrastructure. I'm talking about people as well as physical infrastructure. Everybody knows that if you neglect education, your country does not have a great future. You have got to invest in education and health, and decent public services. You've got to invest in innovation. You've got to, there are so many opportunities as well, with new technologies. We know that there are potentially multi-billion benefits from the introduction of artificial intelligence alone. If we can share the benefits of that productivity together, and again, you do see this in other countries, the state and private sector working together on technology, then that offers us a huge prize. Now, I think some of those results will take longer than 5 years. Any incoming government can never be complacent, but you should be thinking about a 10-year plan. But you've also got to have some quick wins. And that's why that New Deal for working people is so important, to bring that in early, and it will make a difference. We've seen that. We've seen how it can make a difference. We saw how the big difference the national minimum wage made. It wasn't high enough. It needed stronger enforcement when it was first introduced. It still does, by the way. We could be much more ambitious and looking for a £15 living wage. But there are things that you can do that will make a big difference quickly to working people's lives. And I'd like to see those at the front of the queue.
Well, it's interesting you talk about priorities, because, obviously, getting rid of the House of Lords is one of the things Keir Starmer's announced. And a lot of people said, well, that's hardly a top priority. Do you think it will happen?
I think it will happen.
In a first Labour term?
I hope so, because, and I think there clearly has to be a lot of discussion about what that means. I've heard the concerns expressed by some about ensuring that it's always clear that the Commons is, the supreme body over the second chamber. But it seems to me that, of course, working people are worried about the cost of living, but they also care about our democracy and the health of our democracy. There's always been that principle of an elected second chamber. But I think there's also a bigger political question, which Gordon Brown was beginning to open up, about power and where power lies. He was focused on the nations and the regions, and I think there has to be something to say about Britain and the nations and regions who feel that they haven't had the voice and the status that they want to see, and the ability to take decisions over their own lives. So that's important. But I also think there's a big issue about local government. Local government needs revitalising and money if we're going to get the affordable housing we need, not just so that kids don't grow up in damp houses, but so that people can move to jobs more easily. It's important for our economy. Local government could play a much bigger role than currently it's allowed to.
So suppose this sort of constitutional revolution goes ahead and you get rid of the House of Lords and you have some other second chamber, and you modernise in all sorts of ways and you devolve power. There's this thing called the royal family and the constitutional monarchy that we have. Doesn't that start to look really anachronistic?
Well, I'm in a minority view on this. For myself, I've never been a monarchist. I can have respect for the jobs that individuals do, but I've always believed, well, it would just feel odd to me, the idea that somebody should be born to a job rather than apply for it, or get elected to it. But I'm conscious I'm a minority view, and that there are...
So you would have an elected president above all of this, would you, instead of a monarch?
I've got huge respect for the President of Ireland, and again, has a very delicate line to tread. He can't get involved in politics. in an overt way. That's not his role, but he does, particularly the current president, Higgins, has a way of bringing people together, which I think is what many people are yearning for when they talk about the value of constitutional monarchy. It's a way of how do you hold people together, particularly given the choppy times we've had politically, and that sense of service to all the people of a country. And you can see countries where that's done very well through elected presidents. As I say, Ireland for me is an example, but other countries no doubt not so well. So, these things are up for debate. Is it the most pressing issue on my agenda? I'm always gonna be a trade unionist. It's kind of a better deal for working people is what I think is number one.
Well, we've talked about all sorts of change. If you could change the world in one way, how would you change it?
Oh, do you know what I'd love to do? I started off by saying that I think we need to be much more aware of who the wealthiest and most powerful multinational corporations in the world are nowadays. And I think there is a big issue about big tech, who are not very often paying their fair share of tax, though they're benefiting from our health systems and transport systems and everything else. There's a wonderful organising campaign in Coventry at the moment at Amazon, where the GMB union has organised workers who will be taking their first ever strike action, looking for more than the 50 pence an hour increase in pay that they've been offered. I think they're incredibly brave and courageous, and wouldn't it be wonderful to see in this country those workers supported in standing up for their rights to bargain a fair deal and to be organised in a union without fear of the boss, without intimidation or victimisation. So I think, if we could pick some of those big multinational corporations, not just in this country, but worldwide, organise them, support those workers. We're beginning to introduce a little bit of economic democracy, and we need a lot more of that to have a fairer world.
Frances O'Grady, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.